I found the engagement ring 3 weeks after Chloe told me she didn't see a future with me. And honestly, that's when I truly grasped just how perfectly I'd played myself. It was such a punch to the gut, the kind that leaves you breathless, realizing you've been living a lie, or at least, a carefully constructed illusion. But let me back up a little, because the night everything changed started so incredibly normally, it almost felt scripted. We were sitting on our apartment balcony in Charlotte. It was one of those perfect September evenings where the mountains looked so close you could practically reach out and touch them. The air was crisp, the city lights just starting to twinkle. And I made the mistake every guy apparently makes. I started talking about the future like it was real. I'd been casually browsing Zillow for weeks. Nothing serious, just that thing you do when you're 31 and feeling like maybe it's time to stop renting. And I mentioned this house I'd seen in Dilworth, with a backyard big enough for a dog and, maybe one day, a swing set. The way Chloe's wine glass paused halfway to her lips should have been my first clue. She got this look, not quite panic, but damn close. Like I'd just asked her to solve a calculus problem she hadn't studied for. And she said, very quietly, we should probably talk inside. The conversation that followed wasn't a fight, which, paradoxically, somehow made it worse. Chloe had clearly been rehearsing this. She'd probably been carrying it around for weeks, maybe months. And she laid it all out, so calmly, it felt like a business presentation. She loved me, sure, but not in that way anymore. Not in the way that leads to mortgages and matching holiday cards and someone to split the hospital bills with when you're 70. She didn't want marriage. Didn't want kids. Or maybe she did, but not with me. Or maybe not ever. She couldn't really say. There was no timeline, no plan, just this vague sense that what we had right now was enough. And why did I need to ruin it by wanting more? The word she kept using was expectations, like I was some demanding boss instead of the guy who'd spent 4 years building a life with her. And she seemed genuinely confused about why I looked like I'd been hit by a truck. She actually said, I thought you'd appreciate the honesty, as if she'd just done me this huge favor by explaining that I was basically a placeholder, a comfortable habit. One she wasn't ready to quit, but also wasn't planning to keep forever. I just sat there, doing math in my head. Not the financial kind, but the life kind. Adding up all the small ways I'd been investing in a future she'd apparently never bought into. And the number that kept coming up was 0. That night, I slept on the couch. Not because Chloe asked me to, but because lying next to someone who just told you they don't love you the right way feels like volunteering for emotional waterboarding. I stared at the ceiling fan going around and thought about how she'd described us earlier that day to her best friend, Maya, on a call I'd overheard, living our best life, with this laugh that sounded so genuine, I'd actually felt proud. Instagram versus reality, except I'd been dumb enough to think they were the same thing. The next morning, Chloe found me making coffee and apparently decided one devastating conversation wasn't enough, because she added the real kicker. The detail she'd been saving like the worst dessert ever. I think the spark is just gone, she said, leaning against the counter in my old college t-shirt, like we were discussing the weather. We're more like best friends now, or really good roommates. And that's okay, right? That's real love, the comfortable kind. She seemed so pleased with this analysis. So sure she'd figured out some mature truth about relationships that I was too traditional to understand. And I just stood there, coffee pot in hand, thinking about how she described intimacy as a spark, like it was supposed to flicker and die, and you just accept it. Just keep paying rent together and splitting groceries and pretending that's what partnership means. The thing about hitting rock bottom is that it gives you this weird clarity. I went to work that day. I'm a project manager at a tech company, the kind of job where you spend half your time in meetings that could have been emails. And I couldn't focus on anything except this growing realization that I'd been accepting terms I never agreed to. Chloe wanted all the benefits of a relationship, the shared apartment, the +1 to weddings, someone to watch Netflix with at night, but none of the commitment, none of the future, none of the actual partnership parts. And she genuinely thought this was fair. Thought I should be grateful she was being honest instead of recognizing that honesty without commitment is just delayed cruelty. My buddy Noah caught me staring at spreadsheets without seeing them and asked if I was okay. And I almost laughed, because how do you explain that you just realized you've been living in a holding pattern for 4 years, circling and circling, but never actually landing anywhere? That evening, I made a decision that probably sounds crazy, but felt like the sanest thing I'd done in months. If Chloe wanted to be friends, wanted this comfortable roommate situation without expectations or future or actual love, then fine. I'd give her exactly that. But the real version, not the version where I kept pretending we were building something. I started with something small but symbolic. I went into Spotify and removed her from my family plan. Then I opened my calendar and found the reservation I'd made weeks ago for our 4-year anniversary at this fancy steakhouse she'd been wanting to try. The kind of place where you need to book months in advance. And I cancelled it. No discussion, no announcement. Just deleted it like it had never existed. Chloe was in the bedroom on a video call with her brother, Liam, laughing about something. I could hear her through the door saying, "Yeah, everything's great," in that bright voice she used when she was performing happiness. And something in my chest just went quiet and cold and decided it was done. The guest room became my room that night. I moved my clothes over while Chloe was in the shower. Not dramatically, just efficiently, like I was rearranging office supplies. When she came out and saw my side of the closet empty, she got this confused look. Opened her mouth to ask something, then seemed to decide against it. Like maybe she'd already spent her question quota on destroying our relationship, and didn't get to be surprised when I actually listened. I set up my laptop on the small desk, plugged in my phone charger, and looked around at the space that had been for guests and storage, and now was apparently where I lived. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not happiness. Not yet. But relief, like I'd been holding my breath underwater for months and someone had finally told me I was allowed to surface. Chloe knocked on the door around midnight, tentative, and asked if I was coming to bed. And I said, "I think friends probably don't share beds," keeping my voice light, almost joking. I watched her face do this complicated thing where she couldn't decide if she was hurt or annoyed or guilty. She settled on annoyed, said, "You're being childish," and went back to our room. Except it wasn't our room anymore, was it? It was her room, and I was just the guy who paid half the rent. And apparently nothing else mattered beyond that. The next morning started my new routine. No good morning text, even though Chloe was literally one room away. No coffee made for 2. I got up, went for a run along the Catawba River while the city was still waking up. Came back, showered, and left for work without checking if she needed anything or wanted to grab breakfast, or any of the small domestic rituals we'd built over 4 years. Chloe was standing in the kitchen when I walked through with my gym bag, still in her pajamas, looking lost in her own apartment. And she said, "Are you mad at me?" with this tiny voice, like she was testing the waters. I stopped, thought about all the things I could say, all the anger I could unload. And instead, I just smiled. Not mean, not fake, just neutral. And said, "No, I'm not mad. I'm just adjusting to your vision of what we are." Then I left. In my rearview mirror, I could see Chloe standing in the doorway looking after my car, with this expression I couldn't quite read. And I realized I didn't need to read it anymore, because her feelings had stopped being my responsibility the moment she told me I wasn't her future. The first time Chloe realized I wasn't joking about the friend treatment was when she asked me to join her and Maya for drinks downtown, and I said I already had plans. Which I did. Happy hour with some guys from work at a sports bar she'd never been to because it wasn't her scene. She got this look like I'd just spoken a foreign language. Actually said, "Since when do you go out without me?" And I had to resist the urge to laugh, because since when did friends need permission to have separate social lives? I came home around 10, not drunk, but buzzed enough to be honest, and found her sitting on the couch in the dark like she'd been waiting up. Which felt ironic, considering she was the one who demoted us to roommate status. She wanted to know where I'd been, who I was with, why I hadn't texted. And I just shrugged and said friends don't really owe each other minute-by-minute updates. Then I went to my room and closed the door on whatever response she was forming. The real shift happened about a week later when I sat down with my laptop and did something I should have done years ago. I made a spreadsheet. Every shared expense for the past 4 years. Every dinner I'd paid for because I made slightly more. Every vacation where I'd covered the hotel because she was saving for something special. Every time I'd filled her gas tank or bought groceries for both of us or paid the electric bill because she was short that month. The number that came up was $18,473. And I stared at it for a long time, thinking about how I justified every single charge as an investment in our future. Except there was no future. There never had been. I'd just been subsidizing her lifestyle while she figured out if she could do better. I printed it out, highlighted the total, and left it on the kitchen counter with a note that said we needed to talk about finances. Chloe found it the next morning before work, and the explosion was immediate. She called me while I was in a meeting, left 3 voicemails that progressively got more hysterical. And by the time I got home, she'd apparently spent the entire day working herself into a rage. She was standing in the kitchen with the spreadsheet crumpled in her hand. Mascara smudged like she'd been crying, and she started yelling about how I was being petty and cruel and financially abusive. Which was such a wild accusation, I actually laughed. She said I'd never mentioned keeping score before, that this was just what couples did, that I was retroactively punishing her for being honest about her feelings. I let her finish, waited until she was out of breath and shaking, and then very calmly explained that I wasn't asking for the money back. I was just establishing new terms going forward, rent split proportionally to income, utilities 50-50, separate groceries, and absolutely no more I've got this moments, because those were partner moves and we weren't partners. The silence that followed was almost worth the $18,000. Chloe just stared at me like I'd grown a second head, opened her mouth twice without sound coming out, then finally managed to whisper, "You're really doing this?" And I said, yes, I really was. Because friends split things fairly, and I was just following her playbook. She tried a different approach after that. Got soft and sad and said she understood I was hurt, but couldn't we just go back to how things were? Couldn't we just be comfortable again, without all these rules and boundaries? I told her we'd never been comfortable. I'd been uncomfortable for months and just too stupid to admit it. And what she missed wasn't me. It was the version of me that made her life easier without demanding anything in return. She didn't have a response to that. Just grabbed her keys and left. And I heard her car peel out of the parking lot like she was auditioning for Fast and Furious. Things got weird after that in ways I didn't expect. Chloe started dressing up for no reason, doing her makeup on random Tuesday nights, wearing the black dress she knew I liked, even though we weren't going anywhere. She'd suggest dinner at nice restaurants with this hopeful look. And I'd agree, but insist on separate checks, watching her face fall when the waiter brought 2 bills instead of 1. She tried cooking my favorite meal one night, this elaborate pasta thing that took hours. And I thanked her politely, ate exactly 1 portion, put my dirty dishes in the dishwasher, and went to my room to read, leaving her sitting at the table with enough leftovers for a week, and this confused expression like the script wasn't going how she'd planned. The thing is, I wasn't trying to be mean. I was just done performing, done pretending that grand gestures meant anything when she'd already told me the relationship was just comfortable friendship with benefits she no longer wanted to provide. The real turning point came when her laptop died. Just completely bricked itself in the middle of her working from home. And she came to my room in a panic because she had a presentation in 2 hours and her entire life was on that hard drive. Old Cameron would have immediately offered to buy her a new one. Probably would have already been on Apple's website picking out the best model. But new Cameron just looked up from his book and suggested she check Best Buy's financing options. Chloe actually took a step back like I'd slapped her, said, "Are you serious right now?" with this disbelief that would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. I reminded her that friends don't typically buy each other $1,000 electronics. That this was exactly the kind of partner-level support she'd said she didn't want from me. And maybe she could borrow Maya's laptop or use the library computers. She left without another word, and I heard her on the phone in her room, voice thick with tears, probably telling Maya what an absolute jerk I was being. And I felt nothing. Which was its own kind of revelation. What Chloe did next was probably the most predictable move in the playbook. She took it to social media. Not directly. She was smarter than that. But suddenly her Instagram was full of vague posts about emotional manipulation and recognizing toxic behavior and knowing your worth. She shared articles about financial mistreatment with pointed captions, posted sad quotes about loving someone who stopped loving you back. Basically crafted this narrative where I was the villain, and she was the victim of my sudden personality transplant. Her comments filled up with heart emojis from her friends. People I'd met at parties and barbecues all summer, suddenly acting like I was some monster they'd always suspected lurked beneath the surface. I didn't respond, didn't defend myself, just kept living my life and going to work and hitting the gym. And apparently my silence was more damning than any argument because people started asking questions. The narrative started cracking when Caleb reached out. Caleb was our mutual friend, had known both of us for years, and he sent me a long message basically asking for my side because something about Chloe's story wasn't adding up. I sent him the screenshots of our original conversation, the one where she'd laid out her vision of our friendship with rent splitting. And I sent him the spreadsheet with a note explaining I was just implementing the boundaries she'd requested. Caleb read it all, didn't respond for a day, and then apparently showed everything to his girlfriend, who showed it to her friends who knew Maya, who knew Chloe. And suddenly, the social media posts stopped. Just vanished, deleted, like they'd never existed. The comments on her remaining posts shifted, too. Less "you deserve better, queen," and more, "maybe there are two sides to this." I watched the whole thing unfold from the sidelines like I was observing someone else's drama instead of living through my own. Then Chloe's parents showed up. Just appeared at our apartment on a Saturday morning with no warning. I opened the door to find Arthur and Eleanor standing there with overnight bags and expressions like they were staging an intervention. Chloe had apparently called them in tears. Told them I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd become cold and controlling, and she was worried about my mental health. They asked if we could talk. All four of us. And I said, sure. Made coffee. Sat down at our kitchen table like we were negotiating a hostage situation. Arthur did most of the talking, said they were concerned about the changes in my behavior, that this wasn't like me, that whatever was going on between Chloe and me didn't need to end in scorched earth. I listened to the whole speech, nodded in the right places, and then very calmly pulled out my phone and showed them the text exchange from that first night. Let them read Chloe's words about not wanting a future, about the spark being gone, about us being essentially roommates who occasionally shared a bed. Eleanor's face did something complicated. This mix of understanding and disappointment and anger that wasn't directed at me. And she turned to Chloe with this look that probably worked when Chloe was 16, but seemed to still carry weight at 30. Arthur just sat back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands, and said, "Oh, Chloe," in this exhausted way that suggested this wasn't the first time she created drama and then recast herself as the victim. Chloe tried to explain, said I was taking everything out of context, that she'd just been honest about her feelings and I'd, honesty. But her voice kept getting smaller and smaller as her parents kept looking at the evidence and then back at her. They didn't yell, didn't pick sides dramatically, just told Chloe maybe she should come stay with them for a few days while she figured some things out. And the way she looked at me when they said it, like I'd somehow orchestrated her own parents turning on her, would have hurt if I'd had any hurt left to give. Chloe came back 3 days later and this time she wanted to tell me the truth. The real truth, not the version she'd been performing for the past month. She looked smaller somehow, like spending 72 hours with her parents had deflated whatever confidence she'd been running on. And she asked if we could talk without the walls and the distance and the scorekeeping. I said, sure, mostly because I was curious what possible explanation could make any of this make sense. And we sat in the living room like strangers on a first date gone wrong. She started by saying she'd been reading these articles, following these relationship blogs written by women who talked about testing your partner's commitment, about making them chase you to prove they really wanted you. The theory was that if a man truly loved you, he'd fight for you even when you pushed him away. That creating distance and uncertainty would make him realize what he had and come back stronger, more committed, ready to propose and prove his devotion. I sat there processing this information, trying to understand that our entire crisis had been manufactured. That she'd taken 4 years of an actual relationship and gambled it on some internet stranger's advice about manipulation tactics disguised as empowerment. Chloe kept talking, explaining how she'd thought I'd gotten too comfortable, how she wanted me to pursue her again like I had in the beginning. How the articles promised that pulling back would make me step up. She'd expected grand gestures, she said, expected me to fight for us, to refuse to accept her friendship speech and instead prove through actions that I was ready for marriage and kids and the whole future she claimed not to want. The proposal was supposed to come from desperation, from me realizing I couldn't live without her, from her manufactured crisis pushing me to finally commit. She actually thought she was being smart, strategic, playing some kind of relationship chess while I was just trying to survive being told I wasn't good enough. The worst part was watching her realize in real time that her strategy hadn't just failed, but it backfired so spectacularly, it couldn't be undone. I asked her what she expected me to do with this information now, whether knowing it was all a test somehow made it better or worse. And she didn't have an answer. She tried saying we could start over, that now that everything was out in the open, we could build something real. But the foundation was gone, rotted through by lies and manipulation, and the casual cruelty of treating someone's genuine feelings like a game to be won. I told her the saddest part wasn't that she'd tested me. It was that she'd apparently never understood me at all. Because anyone who actually knew me would know I don't chase people who don't want to be caught. I don't fight for relationships where I have to prove my worth. I just walk away and find someone who knows what they have without needing to manufacture drama to feel it. Chloe's face crumpled, and she said something that I think was supposed to be romantic but just sounded desperate. But I bought a ring, too. She disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a small box. Opened it to show me a men's wedding band. Simple platinum. Probably cost her 2 months' salary. And I felt nothing looking at it except maybe pity. She bought an engagement ring while actively sabotaging our relationship. Had been planning to propose while telling me she didn't see a future. And the cognitive dissonance was so extreme I couldn't even pretend to understand it. I stood up, went to my room, and came back with my own box, the one I'd hidden in my sock drawer for 3 months. And watched her face go through every stage of grief in 5 seconds. The ring was beautiful. Vintage setting with a princess cut diamond. Exactly what she'd pointed out once in a jewelry store window, thinking I wasn't paying attention. And I told her I'd been planning to propose on our anniversary. The dinner reservation she didn't know about. The one I'd cancelled when she decided to play games with our relationship. We both just sat there, looking at these 2 rings that represented 2 completely different relationships. Hers built on tests and manipulation, and mine built on trust that no longer existed. Chloe reached for my hand and I pulled back. Not dramatically, just instinctively. And that small motion seemed to communicate more than any speech could. She started crying, real ugly crying, saying she'd ruined everything, asking if there was any way to fix this. And I told her the honest truth. Even if I could forgive the test, I couldn't forget that her first instinct when she wanted something was to manipulate me instead of talking to me. And I couldn't spend my life wondering which version of her was real and which was strategy. She asked what happened now. And I said probably what should have happened a month ago. We'd finish out the lease. I'd already started looking at places. And we'd both move on to people who didn't need to gamble with love to feel like they'd want something. The next few weeks were quiet in that awful way where you're living with someone but existing in parallel universes. Chloe stayed with her parents most nights, came by to get clothes and check mail, and we were painfully polite in the rare moments we overlapped. I signed a lease on a house in Dilworth. Not the one I'd originally seen, but close enough, with a yard and an extra bedroom and space for a future that didn't include someone who thought love was a game with winners and losers. My sister, Samantha, came to help me pack, brought her daughter, Lily, who's 3, and asked a million questions. And when Lily asked where Chloe was, Samantha just said, "Sometimes people go different directions, and that's okay." Which felt like the most honest explanation anyone had given. Moving day was surreal. Chloe showed up to say goodbye. Tried one more time to have a deep conversation about mistakes and growth and second chances. But I was tired, physically and emotionally. And I just hugged her, in that way you hug someone at a funeral, acknowledging what was lost without pretending it could be recovered. She whispered, "I really did love you." And I said I knew I'd loved her, too. But love without trust or respect or basic honesty was just a word people used to justify staying in situations that harmed them. Then I got in my truck with the last box of my stuff and drove away. Watched her get smaller in the mirror until she disappeared and felt that same relief from a month ago, except stronger now, more permanent, like I'd finally stopped holding my breath and remembered how to actually breathe. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my backyard with a beer, watching the sun set behind the Rockies. And my dating app buzzes with a message from someone named Olivia, who seems funny and direct and refreshingly honest about what she wants. I've been on a few dates since the move. Nothing serious, just remembering how to be a person who doesn't have to calculate every interaction or wonder if kindness is investment or manipulation. My house has furniture now. Actual grown-up furniture I picked up myself and pictures on the walls and a garden I'm slowly learning not to kill. Samantha brings Lily over on weekends and we make pancakes and watch cartoons, and I'm teaching her to ride a bike in the driveway. It's not the life I planned 6 months ago, but it's mine, fully mine. Built on decisions I made instead of tests I passed or failed. And some days, that feels like the best revenge of all. Not proving Chloe wrong, but proving to myself I was always worth more than someone else's manufactured crisis could diminish. What do you think is the hardest part about trusting someone again after a betrayal like that?